All right. Hello, everyone. This is Andromeda,
And I'm Tom.
and this is episode. What's today? What's episode number is this? Is it six?
I think
That's what I
I
have.
think we're up to five.
Oh, okay. This is episode
Maybe
five.
maybe it is six.
We'll figure it out. The most important thing is that we are recording on November 13th of 2022. We've realized that we have not been giving the dates in our episodes, which is probably uh, we should probably be doing that, given that there's a little lag between when we publish our episodes and when we record. It's just me and Tom today. Everyone else had other things to do or other obligations, but we were both free. And so we're going to be giving you a pretty quick episode. We don't have a lot to talk about by virtue of it just being the two of us. But that all being said, do you think that we should just get into it?
Yeah, let's get started.
All right. So obviously the midterms happen. We all voted. Hopefully everyone voted for the ICT IWG sponsored candidates in each race. As we all know, the electoral battle is the only viable battle for the future. I'm just joking, of course. We actually debated whether or not to talk about the midterms because of our anti-electoralist positions. But we decided it's probably for the best, not in the sense that we're going to be talking about each candidate and what did they do right, what did they do wrong, what is their policy going to mean in Washington, but more in the sense of general trends. And so I guess biggest thing to talk about midterms was that the Republicans were expecting a major win, the quote unquote red wave, but it turned out to be a red trickle. This is the most evenly divided House and Senate, I believe, since the 1920s. And that caught everyone by surprise. It caught the Democrats by surprise and it caught the Republicans by surprise. And there's a little bit of schadenfreude in that if you were watching conservative live streams about the midterms results on Tuesday. But, you know, what does this mean exactly? What are some key takeaways? What are your reactions to the midterms? Like in a general sense.
I think one, it shows that the extreme reactionary candidates that have been becoming the base of the Republican Party were just not as electable as the more mundane bourgeois candidates run by the Democrats.
Yeah, like I said, we don't
ultimately,
exactly have a lot to say about the midterms.
I suppose that's ultimately a good thing in terms of like a bourgeois popularity contest. But I mean, ultimately, the Democrats did reasonably well in these elections, despite their best efforts not to. There were, up until very recently, there was a line among their advocates in popular media that concern about cost of living and inflation was like a Republican or reactionary talking point, like totally disregarding the fact that the working class is struggling right now. And I think it's not so much that the Democrats won as it is that like a particularly ghoulish and disgusting version of the Republican Party lost. But not by, and like, even if the division between the two parties is unusual for a midterm election, it's not by any convincing majority that they lost. Like, this shouldn't have been difficult for the voice of the institutional global bourgeoisie, like within the electoral politics of the United States.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, which is that the Democrats are still not particularly liked. Biden still has like 36% approval rating, yet his party won despite that. And I think what that really says is that people did not vote for the Democrats. They voted against these like very openly reactionary, pseudo traditionalists, some Peter Thiel, weird alt-right futurist candidates too. And I think you kind of hit the hammer on on the nail, which is that that's not really all that popular. I think the Republicans really are kind of a moral minority, and the only real reason that they have any large amount of power in the United States is purely through the institutions of Congress and through the institutions of the Supreme Court and gerrymandering, et cetera, i.e., the institutions of bourgeois democracy itself. And that kind of leads to the next little takeaway I have, which is the most interesting part of the midterms were actually, for me, the ballot measures. I wrote some little key takeaways. We have abortion being added to the state constitutions of California and Michigan. And in Kentucky, an amendment to their state constitution was blocked, which would have prohibited abortion being added to it. So, on that sense, abortion was a key issue. But then also, more interesting things like Nebraska raised its minimum wage to $15, and Tennessee and Oregon have banned the use of slavery as a form of punishment for prisoners, which is really interesting to me because that's kind of going up against the 13th Amendment, which, if you know about the 13th Amendment, it has that loophole in it saying that slavery can be used as a form of punishment. And I guess, like, what does this mean? Why is it relevant to us? And I think it's relevant to us in the sense that, you know, if these things were popular, if these things have support, then why does it take so long for them to even get considered or even have a chance to be enacted into any law? And I think, again, with like how the Republicans have been able to keep power, it's because of the institutions of bourgeois democracy and our republic in general. The entire structure of government is meant to kind of moderate and tamper down the opinions of the masses, and that was kind of explicit all the way from the founding of America to now.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Like, it's instead of viewing like these like electoral victories as being victories, what we should really be recognizing them as are it's a pressure release valve, and small concessions through a system that's like ultimately beneficial to maintaining appearances for the bourgeois class. Like,
yeah,
the American democracy like holds back the will of the working class more than it could possibly advance it, because ultimately the democratic machinery is a tool of class conciliation. Like, we can only have this democracy in its current form while there are like classes in antagonism of one another, like with active class struggle.
Yeah, and I think that kind of just goes into our wider position on reforms in general. Like, I don't think any of us are upset that slavery was banned in Tennessee or Oregon, but we have to acknowledge that, you know, this was not like a revolutionary act. This was a concession that each of those states were willing to make. You know, if you want to be a little bit more positive about it, think about what we can achieve if we didn't even have these institutions to begin with. Think about what we could achieve if we didn't have a ruling class to begin with.
Oh, but that would be communism, Andrew.
Oh, God. I forgot. This is a social democratic podcast, by the way. We're going to be rebranding now. That's all we have to say for midterms. At least that's all I have to say about midterms. Anything else?
Oh, thank God it's over. And we can, let's
get into the juicy bits.
So the,
yeah, you go.
Very underreported. There is currently a landlord cartel being sued in a antitrust class action lawsuit originating in San Diego. And credit where credit's due. The like major reporter on this matter was originally ProPublica, who did a big expose on it. Unsurprisingly, it's not really been picked up by the rest of the media.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you say underreported, you really do just mean ProPublica wrote 2 articles about it.
A few others, like Gizmodo, copied and pasted sections of those articles. So there's that out there also.
Oh.
So for our listeners who have likely not run into this news piece at all. So there was a class action antitrust lawsuit filed in San Diego on October 19th against several of the largest property management companies in the US. The suit is Bason versus RealPage. And they name Greystar Real Estate Partners, Lincoln Property Company, and FPI Management, which are the number 1, 2, and 5 largest landlords in the country, like corporate property managers. Also named in the lawsuit were 4 more in the top 25. And in that list of the top 25, only 2 fall outside of the list. Like, so these are major real estate companies that are overseeing an enormous percentage of the rental properties in the United States. So the cartel, as we'll be referring to them, used a website and a company called RealPage to price fix rents during a nationwide housing crisis and in the lead up to it. The analytics software company describes itself on Google as providing data analytics, property management software, and services to effectively manage properties and real estate. So this cartel is a new form of the same old grift. They use software to indirectly fix prices between different landlords and property management companies. When companies contract with RealPage, they submit all of their rental units information and their active rents, which are then added to a database and like analyzed by the software to spit out a rent. So RealPage claims to help eliminate the risk of collusion that could occur with manual pricing, because historically these landlords would call each other to ask about rents in nearby buildings. But they also promise users rents between 3 and 7% higher than market value on that same website. So those two things can't exist like in a vacuum, like that. You're eliminating collusion, but you're also driving rents for everybody 3 to 5% higher than market. So in addition to this indirect price fixing, there's also a message board service of some sort called the RealPage user group that has invitation only subcommittees. And those include subjects like revenue management. And these are landlords who are theoretically business rivals to one another, discussing business practices on this services website. So this is a quote from Jeffrey Roper. He's the architect of YieldStar, which is the previous name of the software that's used by these landlords. And he was also previously prosecuted in the late 80s and early 90s under antitrust when he was working for Alaska Airlines for price fixing in the airline industry. So there's a history there. So we said there's too much empathy going on here, Roper said. This is one of the reasons we wanted to get pricing off-site.
Yeah, that quote, when I read that quote, this was a very dark article to read, and I didn't even get to fully do a deep read. I kind of skimmed it because you sent me the link last night and I had to go to bed. But that quote, I wrote it down and I like circled and highlighted it. That was very dark, and it really just, we are talking about the inhumanity of capitalism. I do mean that literally. This is an article about a software that is quite literally designed to not have empathy for tenants, not have empathy for people, for human beings, for life.
And it's worth pointing out too that like this software, it is doing in property management the same thing that is done in all other major industries under capitalism.
They talk about that in the article too, where this whole idea, if I recall correctly, was stemmed from this guy basically going, why aren't landlords doing what everyone else does? And like having these soulless algorithms determine who gets to live and who gets to die.
Yeah, there's just too much empathy. Human beings might possibly feel that there's too much empathy. We need to have a cold and inhuman software program analytically remove the empathy.
You know, Charles Darwin, he wrote about how human empathy was a sign of evolutionary progress. I don't think he ever considered what if that was getting in the way. I mean, like we're kind of joking about that, but I feel like oftentimes PragerU, Ben Shapiro type people will talk about like the inhumanity and the soullessness of communism or of cultural Marxism, their favorite little buzzword, and like how you're reduced to a number. You're under communism. You're not an individual anymore. You're just a little cog in a collective. This is literally a machine that gets to determine the price of the place you have to live in. Having a home being one of the foundational aspects of the hierarchy of needs, and we're just told that, hey, you got to suck it up because this is more important. There are some things that are bigger than humanity, and that is the market, and that is value and price and
Well,
rent.
according to Jay Parsons, the current vice president of RealPage,
Uh-huh.
you know, these rents can only rise as incomes rise, because if people can't afford it, you can't lease it.
Oh, I'm sure that's true. But okay, there's a lot that's being left out of that. Sure, that is true. You cannot charge $1 million a week in rent for like
No,
people who are working for $14 an hour, but you can raise rent so high that it takes up the majority of their paycheck, or take
correct. And
and
like
like
the
okay,
historical
it's
knowledge like that people went into renting with is like you should be spending roughly 1/3 of your income to keep a roof over your head. Like that's
yeah,
like the common knowledge.
that's not
And
allowed
like when
anymore.
when
Quite
your
literally, that's
choice is
not allowed.
homeless, when your choice is homelessness or paying more, you're going to choose to pay more. So
Yeah,
like just because people can't afford it doesn't mean that Jay Parsons can't help them lease it anyway.
yeah.
Like
Or
I
there's
would pay
things like payday
60% of my
loans.
income to
Yeah.
not be homeless, and that should not be acceptable.
Well, there shouldn't
Um,
be a rent in the first place. That should not exist, and that has been something that has been pointed out ever since the dawn of capitalism with Adam Smith and Jean-Jacques Rousseau were all talking about how landlords don't particularly do anything. Adam Smith, I only read segments of Wealth of Nations, but I do remember this. Talked about like landlords are not a productive class. Like they don't produce anything. They simply sit on something and they derive rent from it. And that it's the actual tenants who are the people who are actually maintaining it and adding value to it. And so knowledge of this has been around for a while. And of
correct.
course, like
And
with things like landlords, you get things like I feel like there's this kind of great evilness to a landlord that a lot of people feel, that they like people hate landlords more than they would hate than like your regular general CEO. I think it's because landlords, I think everyone realizes they don't do anything, but also they have a great amount of control over your life. And so with that, you get things like Georgism, which argues that there is no class struggle. There are two classes, landlords and non-landlords. And like if you're a McDonald's worker, you should be allying with your manager to fight against the person who owns the land underneath the McDonald's.
well, coincidentally, since you picked McDonald's is actually a real estate company
Yep.
masquerading as a
I
fast
knew
food
that. I knew that because
restaurant.
I learned about that when I worked there.
Um,
Because even if the store goes out of business, you're still making money off the land for whoever occupies it next.
So, and then, since the store is only like a secondary consideration, then they can have their own stores like in active competition with each other. And if one of them goes out of business, then, whatever. I think though, like what we're seeing here too is like the reality that like landlording is a pre-capitalist like holdover. Like it literally
Yes.
comes from feudalism.
And that's why Adam
And
Smith was so opposed to it, because he thought it was an archaic feudal holdover that had no place in a modern society.
which he was absolutely right.
Yes.
Um,
Give
we
credit where
should,
credit is due for
oh
Adam
yeah.
Smith.
I
He
mean,
was very
when,
foundational.
when you read Marx's quotations of the various economists in Capital, like,
oh yeah,
there's a grudging respect for Smith.
And Ricardo too.
Correct, but he makes it very clear that the rest of them are vulgar economists, by which he means mouthpieces for the bourgeoisie. So to get back on topic real quick, so very shortly after the release of ProPublica's original expose, there was an anti-class action lawsuit filed. There are 4 firms and a nonprofit, the Justice Catalyst Law, dedicated to doing cases and legal strategies for economic and social justice, who are pursuing this. And apparently they had also been investigating this for some time before that article was originally released. But so that's where we're at with this one right now. So the next time you look at your rent and you're like, man, who the hell can afford this? Remember that your landlord very likely had a computer program decide that they could extort that extra 3 to 4% from you.
He clicked the button and he decided that like 50. Oh, something else that was mentioned in the article, but the software RealPage will sometimes let landlords know, like, hey, I know you have like 100 units, but if you fill up only 50 of those units, you can like jack up the prices and say that you only have 50 units. Really, you can create artificial scarcity with your housing. So like, and that reminds me of this sign. I believe it was from the 70s, somewhere in like the new left movement that was in New York City, that basically said, there's 150,000 homeless people living on the streets in Manhattan, and there's 200,000 empty apartments. And yeah, that was an old sign, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that concept of just purposefully not renting out things or renting out spaces so that you can create an artificial demand, that has always existed, and that's kind of just a natural thing you can do under capitalism. That's part of why, contrary to common perception, it's not exactly a very efficient economic mode of production, because it constantly relies on, the destruction of value or purposefully holding out of services and resources like that.
Well, it's like, it does. It's what used to be referred to as the anarchy of production in socialist economic critiques, where like capitalism ultimately does indirectly come upon processes that will be highly efficient, far more so than any like social formations that could have come before it. And those efficiencies are a social requirement for the working class to move beyond capital ultimately. But the way that it comes to that efficient status isn't through any kind of like forethought, but through improvements in technology and engineering, which then contribute to the increased organic composition of capital and its tendency to fall, but windfall profits for early adopters. And also through like trial and error, essentially, where like in terms of like distribution, for example, less effective distribution methods and routes will be overtaken over time by more effective ones, because most businesses are operating on very narrow margins. So half a point here, half a point there, that translates to millions of dollars at the end of the year for the boards and CEOs. So like the end point that capitalism realizes, like through its like totalizing nature, tends to be very efficient, but the process of getting there is wildly inefficient. And it comes in fits and starts. And I think it also shows, like, to speak of like the totalizing nature of like capitalist ideology, like bourgeois ideology in our society, that we have this like pre-capitalist social construct in the form of like landlording that is still a reality of everybody's day-to-day life. Even if you're paying a mortgage or outright own your own home, your employer very likely is paying rent. Like these rents like extract value. And because there's no better way to do that in capitalism, and under capitalism, everything has to extract value, we carry this system forward. It's just another broken promise of the bourgeois revolutions.
You were the one who did a deep dive on this. Do you have any closing remarks?
I mean, I think everything that needs to be said has been said. Like, you jumped in there and took some of my bluster, Andromeda, but
oh, I'm so sorry.
but
This is why we have to have like an actual script. No more of these like notes and outlines.
Oh yeah, everybody would love to like listen to us programmatically, like just reading. It would be very
Why not? All the
entertaining.
good podcasters do it. Sorry,
But no, this
stealing
is.
your thunder.
I think this. It's okay. I think I wish there were more people to steal my thunder. So, no, I think this is just an issue that we should watch. Does it die in the courts? You know, what's ultimately decided? I could easily see some bourgeois judge who owns a handful of rental properties themselves, not really wanting to acknowledge the implicit and explicit like price fixing that's going on here. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with this in the courts. But for now, that's really where we're up to in the story.
Well, with that said, I think we should move on from a story about the heart of darkness to a story about kind of a light shining at the end of the tunnel. And I think it's time to give a little update on the situation in Iran and the continued protests and struggles that are ongoing right now. And, you know, for anyone listening, we talked about Iran a bit a couple episodes ago, but the ICT and IWG has been having its eyes on Iran for quite some time now. Has it been over a year? I'm trying to remember when the first article about the oil workers was published by the ICT. It's been a while. It's been longer than the existence of this podcast. And
that it definitely has.
Yeah, and the reason why there's such a focus on Iran is because it's a place where some of the most courageous acts of class consciousness and workers' activity has been happening, and it's been happening under probably one of the most hostile regimes to that kind of activity. And, you know, what we're talking about has been the workers on the oil fields in Iran who have for years been struggling with these terrible conditions. They have been openly striking, and they have not just been striking at each individual workplace, but they have created a council for organizing workers at each of these facilities, and they have been being repressed. The ICT published translations of their statements for the world to read, and I would highly recommend you go read them. But there's just such a bravery to it, and it really does give you a sense of hope, because some of those statements are like, yeah, our friends are still in prison, we haven't been able to see them in a while, but we will be marching in solidarity with the women's protesters, we will be chanting women, freedom, and life with them.
Yeah, and there's the oppression of the like the petro workers in Iran is like so severe that they don't even necessarily know how many of their like political prisoners like have been taken, or even like alive. what their status is. They don't even know how many people have been taken by the Iranian government, and they were requesting that like individual workplaces that are part of these protests send in a list with photos and information of the names of people that they know that were abducted by the Iranian government. And like, in spite of that, they continue, you know, in addition to the women's rights protesters that are ultimately protesting an attempt by like a reactionary government to discipline the working class with the hijab and with strict morality laws. The strikes from the oil workers are explicit in being against poverty, discrimination, and inequality, and the whole scale of anti-women and anti-worker brutality. That's a quote from the Council of Organizing Protests by Oil Workers from October of this year.
Thank you for blowing that up. You mentioned, if I may just kind of interject a little bit, because I think it's important. Because of the nature of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the suppression of information, it's very hard to kind of verify numbers. But based on what I've read so far, this is coming from an organization called Iran Human Rights Watch, NGO. And of course, I have to do another little tangent and say, with NGOs, depending on the source, there's like a lot of skepticism around NGOs from people on the left. And a lot of that is very much justified. But based on what I've read up about this organization, it was founded by an Iranian man who fled from the regime and has contacts in Iran still. And based off of numbers that they have, by their estimates, around 326 people have been killed by police so far in this series of protests, which is pretty kind of shocking. But of course, 320 people, if I recall correctly, in 2019, that number was around 1,000. But, what I'm trying to say is, like, this isn't just like a semi-hostile to these protests. These are like actively very repressive, very hostile to these protests, have no issue killing protesters. And yet the people of Iran and the workers in the oil fields are fighting regardless.
They are. And they did something that, like so many times, fails in protest movements here in the US. And they drew the link between the original protest that was,
and the working class as a whole,
in response to the murder of Mesa Amini by the morality police, and they generalized it to the class as a whole. They recognized that is a class, that this is a class issue. And, this is like in the context of it being so like in vogue for bourgeois political officials like Trump or ex-British PM Tony Blair to give like lip service to these protests. And a lot of the media that we have to consume to produce this podcast also, they put the message out as they want it to be heard. And, to them, it's a matter of, women having to break through a glass ceiling in Iran. But among the Iranian people, it's understood that, this is a class issue.
Oh my God. There was this awful Atlantic article, and the Atlantic, it really is one of the worst magazines in the world. But they had this terrible article talking about how, God, I don't like using this term because I don't think I fully grasp it, but I would argue very Orientalist article basically saying that that America should take credit for the Iranian protests because like the Iranian women are being inspired by our women movement and our democracy and our freedom. And I'm just, fuck you. Shut up. You actively voice for, and also a lot of, I saw this horrifying photo of like a solidarity protest in Washington, D.C., where they were all waving flags of the Shah. And like that was not a good regime.
No.
That was also not a very, like, everyone loves those photos of like, look at these Iranian women at the beach, and no one likes to talk about the Shah's secret police or his own very conservative outlook on society.
No, because that would mean entangling the narrative with American imperialism, which we have to pretend at all times is, that doesn't exist. We export freedom, not capitalism and not wage slavery.
There was a joke I heard. I'm going to repeat it here. The Atlantic should really be renamed the North Atlantic Treaty Magazine. And it's true because like they very are much anytime an atrocity or a time to defend U.S. empire comes up, you can count on the Atlantic for bringing that, and they've been doing it forever. They were also one of the first magazines to go against Reconstruction from a liberal perspective too, all the way into 1870s.
They're also big on like the both sidesism.
Yeah.
And like on an unrelated issue, like they drew my ire recently by running a reactionary op-ed piece by a conspiracy theorist, basically saying like we didn't know like all of the information during COVID. So like let's let bygones be bygones. And the end result of this is bygones. Because it's printed in the Atlantic, conspiracy theorists and reactionaries have latched onto that as being a liberal piece where they're apologizing for vaccinations. So like literally the Atlantic does nothing but muddy the water at every turn. It's almost like they do it on purpose. But honestly, I think it comes more from like misguided values.
That's the project of liberalism in general. And you're right, it is about misguided values. And that really just goes to show you how fucking bankrupt liberal values are. Because no, I don't believe everyone... And just a little tangent, maybe I can talk about it later in an episode. I also saw a horrible article in a similar vein talking about like, you know, a lot of kids these days are talking about like maybe we have our idea of the First Amendment all wrong. I believe that he literally argued in this article that that freedom of the press is what stops slavery. He said that you can only get rid of hate through open public debate. And I'm like, no, you can only get rid of hate in the form of the Civil War by having the Civil War. The Civil War was not won in the op-ed pages. It was won with blood on the battlefield. And
that's like an exceptionally poor take, because like antagonism in that, like, I mean, it was stoked by Lincoln in the North, like through words, but in terms of actions,
we're getting off topic. But
let's not forget that the South was the first to declare, like to secede. Like, so, like, it's not even that it was like slave patrols didn't give a shit about people's thoughts. Like, slavery in the United States in the South in the 1900s was like a holdover from like previous eras of capitalism, and ultimately ultimately it was an inefficient system, but it was a reflection on the difficulty of working those lands with the industrial techniques that existed at the time. But anyway, this is really getting like out there in the weeds, but individuals' thoughts about it had ultimately very little to do with the material reality of the abolition of slavery.
All right, so for our final topic, we just want to give a quick update on the railway strikes in the U.S., because little bits of news have been coming out here and there. The most notable is that the BMWED, which is one of the larger of their unions, have decided to push back the strike deadline to after Thanksgiving. And they specifically cited in the articles I read, the justification for this was that they didn't want to negatively impact things like Thanksgiving or Black Friday, which when I read that, I thought to myself, isn't that kind of the point of a strike? To disrupt?
Yeah, that goes back to my point from the last episode where, this is a time when the workers need to be taking advantage of the leverage that they hold over capital more generally.
Yeah, now is the time.
It's not like in no strike action is it the workers' fault for demanding appropriate like compensation and redress of their grievances. It's always the fault of the bosses for creating those situations in the first place. And of course, it's a mouthpiece of the bosses pushing it back yet again after Biden had his emergency committee that pushed it back so it couldn't impact the election.
Yeah. But I think actually the most notable thing that we are going to talk about, and we're going to talk about this pretty briefly, is media reporting on this. Because I read a couple articles, I read 3 articles about this deadline pushback. One was from CNBC, the other one from Reuters, and the other was from the World Socialist website, which is ran by the Trotskyists, SEP. And in the CNBC and the Reuters, they talked about the deadline pushback. However, in the WSWS, they also talk about how on the same day that this was announced on Wednesday, that they were pushing the deadline back, a railway worker in Kansas, was killed on the job in an accident. And that was actually the second person to die in a railway incident in 4 days. Previously, there was a guy who was killed in an accidental explosion on a railway. And that was within 4 days of this. And I didn't see that mentioned in any other article.
Absolutely not, because anything from the bourgeois media is ultimately going to be conciliatory towards the interests of the rail lines.
I want to quickly mention, WSWS did cite their source on this. Like they pointed to a statement made by the local union of that worker that was killed, confirming that this did indeed happen. This isn't like someone making up a story to add to for dramatic factor. Like there's sources backing this up. It's not like this wasn't known to other media sources.
No, and unfortunately, when you're reporting the events of the capitalist hellscape we live in, honestly, you don't have to make things up. As socialists, we have the benefit of being able to pursue our politics and come to our conclusions scientifically, because we don't have to lie about what the system is and isn't.
That's kind of all I really have to say about that. Like I said, news about this has kind of been slowing down a little bit. Like the last big article I can find on what's been happening was from 2 weeks ago, and I think we mentioned it in our previous episode. So now we're just kind of watching things kind of fall apart because of the U.S. government's position on industries such as railways, where they literally have constitutional authority to declare a strike illegal, and the nature of these unions that are really trying to work with the Biden administration. And of course, by working with the Biden administration, you are going against the interests of your membership. But that's kind of our whole point about unions.
That's the role that they've played for well over 100 years now in the United States, ever since the AFL and CIO took over the labor union leaderships of basically all industries. They went from imperfect appendages of the working class to a mouthpiece of the bosses. And it's built right into capital, as the dominant ideology of capital, and it's the ideology mongers of it, like the bourgeoisie. They will always find a way to express themselves in the spontaneous actions of the class, and that's why it's so important for the class to come together in these struggles, and for the working class to express itself through its own organs of power, while we also work towards building the party of the future.
Yeah, and I think with that all being said, we can wrap up this episode. A very rare, I think our first duo episode.
I think so, and the first time we've kept to time.
And the first time we mentioned a date of recording. All right. Well, I think that wraps it up. It's been a pleasure discussing this with you, and it's been a pleasure for our audience to be listening.
You too, Andromeda. Talk to you again soon.
All right. Have a good night.
You too. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.